political and social commentator James Melville. James, HS2, big story of the week. Today we learn that, first of all, for a railway line that's going to go from slightly to the west of London to slightly to the south of Birmingham, it won't actually get you to the centre of both cities. That's about 100 miles or something. That's going to cost the nation, by the newest estimate, £180 billion. No one needs it. In fact, to get from central London to central Birmingham now will take you a little longer than it used to. No one needs this. If you don't have the branch lines to Leeds and Manchester, which have both been cancelled, there is no point to HS2. And nevertheless, this pointless stretch of track will cost us £180 billion. And half the reason is some of the money that some of the executives there are being paid. Outrageously, we learned today that there are 42 HS2 fat cats on more than £150,000 a year. And the boss, the chief executive, is on £776,000 a year. He is now departing, no doubt with a nice package. And what has he done? He's presided over abject failure. I'm not necessarily pointing the finger exclusively at him, but he must bear some of the blame. The whole thing is a shambles, and yet we have nearly 50 people earning an absolute fortune to this day. Outrageous, a scandal, a national disgrace.
I think this particular project sums up this government. It's going to be part of this government's legacy. An enormous waste of money, taxpayers' money. We were told many years ago that one of the priorities of the government was Northern Powerhouse. Remember that? Whatever happened? You know, the purpose of this was to make transport links better in the north of England, because they've been neglected for decades. That's effectively been axed. There's still an enormous price tag attached to that, not just in terms of the infrastructure costs, but also some of the salaries that you've touched on as well. And who's paying for this? Yet again, the taxpayer. We're treated like suckers by the government. They're fleecing us on projects that aren't going to make a blind bit of difference. You can add, we talked about ULEZ, that's another example of that as well. We have a government that seems to be struggling in a number of different factors. Incompetence, wastage of taxpayers' money, failed projects, and yet we also have on the other side of it a lot of infrastructures and public services that do need drastic updating, whether it's to do with healthcare, education, crumbling schools, or NHS waiting lists. We've got transport delays all around the country. The government, on every key measure of infrastructure and public services they've been in since 2010, have failed. And hopefully they will pay a heavy price at the next election for this. Yes. I cannot think of many achievements that this government have they can genuinely boast about. It's one failed project after another. It's absolutely outrageous.
HS2 is a catastrophe. I note that Labour mayors are meeting in Leeds to discuss what they call the cutting off of the north. So they're all meeting in Leeds, and I'm wondering how they got there. Not by train, I guess. Let's move on. Interesting report by the Children's Rights Organisations Alliance. That includes Save the Children, Just for Kids Law, and the Children's Rights Alliance for England. They've told the government in a long report that social distancing, the closure of schools and playgrounds during the pandemic had long-lasting and era-defining impacts. And what they are essentially saying is you should have thought about the kids. They were not at risk from COVID, and you shut them out of their schools. You locked them down like adults. And basically badly affected an entire generation of school kids. And what this report is saying is, if you'd have just thought about the kids for a second, thought about how much risk they were at, which was pretty much zero, you wouldn't have done this.
Yeah, I think out of all the aspects of COVID and the response, the welfare or lack of approach to welfare for the kids was the worst one. They're off school on off for about 18 months. Kids were told that they were the super spreaders. Remember that?
That's right, yeah. Save your granny and all that.
And you combine with the messaging and the framing of kids doing their part of the problem, combined with, aspects of the coercion of the vaccine, combined with the lockdowns, the impact on a lot of kids as well, who didn't then return to school. There was a lot of children from poorer backgrounds who, when they were in lockdown, couldn't do online learning. They didn't have the ways and means financially, whether it's through Wi-Fi or laptops or whatever it might be, to keep on top of their curriculum. A generation was forgotten about and slightly smeared and used as collateral and became collateral damage. I think it's out of all the aspects of COVID, and I say something as a parent, the children went through this, what happened to the children in COVID was absolutely disgraceful. And when we have the COVID inquiry, we get the findings that come out of it, hopefully front and centre will be some severe criticism of the government in terms of what they did to our children during the COVID response.
Totally.
And meanwhile, as I've mentioned before, Sweden didn't lock down the schools. Sweden didn't lock down generally, didn't have mandates. And guess who's got the lowest excess deaths in Europe over that period of COVID, from 2020 to 2022? It's Sweden, and they protected their economy. Hopefully lessons will be learned from this, but it must never, ever happen again. And that starts with what they did to the children during the COVID era.
You're right. We let down an entire generation of children really, really badly. And I note that one of our medical officers, Jenny Harris, of course, because of her fine work in the COVID crisis, now Dame Jenny Harris, all of the people who steered us so disastrously through the COVID crisis got honoured. It's unbelievable. Anyway, she said that should there be another pandemic, God forbid there won't be, but should there be another pandemic, that Britain would probably adopt a Swedish approach. Now, that is after Jenny Harris and the rest of them spent the entire COVID crisis saying, we can't do it like Sweden. Sweden's doing it wrong. Oh, no. Sweden was turned into an international pariah for being the only country that handled the COVID crisis properly. But more crucially, we need to talk about what we did to our kids. It's not a pretty story. Now, you're from Scotland, aren't you, James? What do you think about the Scottish government's, what some people are calling a sort of a legal crack den? Actually, they won't be smoking crack, to be fair, but they've set up a drug consumption room, or they're going to. For some reason, it's going to cost 2.3 million quid. It's a room. Basically, junkies and drug addicts can go to this room and take drugs. They can shoot up heroin, snort coke, all of that stuff under medical supervision. I've seen what the room will look like. I mean, that doesn't look like any kind of a fun place to do drugs. It's basically white Formica cubicles. But is this a good idea, or are we basically, because of course anyone who goes there will be exonerated and will not be prosecuted for possession of illegal drugs. They take their own drugs there, they take them there, and doctors look after them per se. I mean, is this a good idea, or are we essentially here legalising extremely strong and dangerous drugs?
I think it's piecemeal stuff, and we see what comes with results and whether it's been a success. It's probably too early to judge. But the bigger problem is the problem itself. It's not being answered. It's the communities where this is happening, particularly in and around Glasgow, where there's a huge drug problem in and around those communities. So therefore, the Scottish government need to be going to themselves. How has this happened on our watch? How have many of these communities fallen into poverty? You know, someone has seen some of the areas of Glasgow and inner city Dundee, and a lot of the deindustrialised areas have been largely forgotten about for decades. Successive governments ignoring what's going on in those communities, not just in Scotland, it's happening in obviously the north of England as well. We touched on with the platitudes of Northern Powerhouse, it didn't happen. We need our governments to look at what is happening in those communities and try and find ways to rebuild those communities. And if they rebuild those communities, more opportunities, better facilities, more infrastructures, and give people some hope and purpose in those communities, then by root and branch policy, over time, you start addressing the drug problem. But we're not having our governments doing that. So instead, we're coming up with these slightly strange solutions.
It's a strange idea, isn't it?
But it will not solve the problem.
Bring your own drugs. I mean, it's a very strange idea. And I share your scepticism about it. James, fantastic to talk to you as always.